The morning air was sharp, a blade of cold honed by the high, lonely places. Silas liked it that way. The cold kept things simple. It reminded him that survival was a matter of fact, not feeling. He'd built his cabin with solitude in mind, each log a declaration of his intent to be left alone. For 5 years, the declaration had been honored. The forest asked nothing of him but respect, and the mountains nothing but caution. He'd forgotten the sound of a human voice that wasn't his own, and he preferred it. He was splitting logs when he first saw them, his axe halfway through its arc. He stopped, the heavy steel buried in the pine. They stood at the edge of the clearing, small and dark against the bright snow. 3 of them. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image. They looked like young saplings, impossibly thin, their forms blurred by the gentle fall of new snow. Then the smallest one coughed, a dry, rattling sound that broke the morning stillness, and they became real. Children, lost and half-frozen. The tallest, a girl with eyes far too old for her face, held the hand of a boy who stared at Silas's cabin with a kind of desperate awe. The third, the little one who had coughed, was a bundle of rags in the girl's other arm. Silas didn't move. He watched them, his face as blank as the winter landscape. A part of him, the part that had built this cabin, wanted to turn away, to go inside and bar the door and pretend they didn't exist. But another part, a part he thought had died long ago, was already calculating. The distance, the cold, the fading light. He pulled the axe from the log with a grunt and set it aside. He didn't speak. Words were for a world he'd left behind. He simply gestured with his head toward the cabin. The girl didn't move. She held her ground, her small chin set with a fierce, protective pride. Her eyes darted from Silas to his axe, then back to his face. He understood. He was a large man, bearded and weathered, a creature of the forest as much as the bears he sometimes saw lumbering in the distance. He took a slow step back, then another, putting distance between himself and them, making himself smaller, less of a threat. He opened his hands to show they were empty. He waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the snow. Finally, the boy pulled on the girl's hand. A muffled word was spoken. The girl's shoulders slumped in a barely perceptible motion of defeat, or perhaps surrender. She took a hesitant step forward, pulling her siblings with her. They moved like frightened deer, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. Silas turned and walked to his cabin, leaving the door open behind him. The smell of wood smoke and old leather greeted them, a stark contrast to the biting cold. He didn't look back to see if they followed. He knew they would. They had no other choice. Inside, he went about his routine. He added a log to the fire, the flames leaping up to lick the fresh wood. He filled a kettle with water from the bucket by the door and set it on the hearth to warm. He did not speak to them, did not acknowledge their presence as they huddled together just inside the doorway, dripping snow onto his wooden floor. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a rhythm honed by years of solitude. He was showing them, not telling them, that there was no threat here. There was fire. There was shelter. In his world, that was enough. He pulled 3 mismatched wooden bowls from a shelf and set them on the rough-hewn table. He ladled a thick, savory stew into each one, the steam rising in fragrant clouds. The smell of cooked meat and root vegetables filled the small cabin. He placed a loaf of dark bread and a knife beside the bowls. Then he retreated to his corner, to the warm chair by the window, and picked up a piece of pine he'd been carving. He began to work the wood with his knife, the shavings falling to the floor in silent curls. He was giving them space, a chance to eat without the pressure of his gaze. He heard the scrape of a chair, then another. He heard the clink of a spoon against a bowl. He heard the small, hungry sounds of children eating. He kept his eyes on the wood in his hands, on the shape of the bird that was slowly emerging from the grain. He didn't look up, but he felt the change in the room. The cold, desperate silence had been replaced by a fragile warmth. For the first time in 5 years, Silas was not alone, and he did not know what to do with that feeling. The cabin felt smaller, crowded not by their physical presence, but by their unspoken needs, their silent histories. He could feel their eyes on him, studying him, measuring him. The eldest girl, the one who held the others together with a will of iron, watched him with a suspicion that was almost palpable. He could feel it on the back of his neck, a prickling awareness. She sat ramrod straight, her spoon held tight in her fist, as if it were a weapon. The boy, younger and softer, ate with a ravenous hunger, his gaze darting around the small space, taking in the details of Silas's life, the hunting knife on the mantel, the snowshoes leaning against the wall, the stack of furs in the corner. The youngest, a girl no older than 4 or 5, had fallen asleep over her bowl, her small face smudged with gravy. The firelight flickered across her pale features, making her look even more fragile, like a porcelain doll left out in the snow. When they were finished, the eldest girl gathered the bowls with a quiet efficiency. She looked toward the water bucket, then at Silas, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a slight nod as she proceeded to wash the dishes, her movements precise and practiced. She was used to work, he could see that, used to taking care of things. When she was done, they huddled together again by the fire, a small island of humanity in his vast sea of solitude. He knew he should ask. He should find out who they were, where they had come from, why they were alone in the middle of a wilderness that could swallow them whole without a trace. But the words wouldn't come. They felt like foreign objects in his mouth, clumsy and intrusive. His language was the swing of an axe, the feel of wood grain, the track of a deer in the snow. So instead, he rose from his chair and pulled a thick bearskin from the pile. He laid it on the floor near the hearth, as far from his own sleeping cot as the small cabin would allow. It was the best he could offer, a place to sleep, a promise of warmth through the long, cold night. The eldest girl watched him, her dark eyes unblinking. She seemed to understand. She gathered her siblings and settled them onto the fur, tucking the edges around them with a maternal tenderness that tugged at something deep inside Silas's chest, something he had buried long ago. He returned to his chair, to his carving. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside, a lonely sound. The children slept. And Silas sat, a silent guardian in the dim light, the unfinished bird in his hand, wondering what he had let into his carefully constructed world. The silence of the night was different now. It was not the empty, peaceful silence he was accustomed to. It was a silence filled with the soft breaths of sleeping children, a sound that was both profoundly comforting and deeply unsettling. He found he could not sleep. He sat in his chair, the fire burning low, and watched the rise and fall of their small forms on the bearskin rug. Each breath they took was a question. What now? The morning brought no answers, only a cold gray light that filtered through the single window of the cabin. The children were still asleep when he rose. He moved with the practiced quiet of a hunter, stoking the fire, putting on a pot of coffee, cutting slices of bread. He worked with his back to them, aware of the moment the eldest girl awoke. He didn't turn, but he felt her gaze on him, watchful and wary. "There's porridge on the stove," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to them. The girl didn't reply, but he heard the soft shuffle of her feet as she went to serve her siblings. He drank his coffee standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered trees. He was a man who lived by the seasons, by the simple, unyielding laws of nature. And nature had a cruel clarity. The weak did not survive. These children were weak. They were lost. Without him, they would die. The thought settled in his chest like a stone. It was a responsibility he had not asked for, a complication he had actively fled. His life here was a careful balance of solitude and survival. They were an unknown variable, a weight that could tip the scales. The boy, whose name he still didn't know, approached him cautiously. He held out a small, carved object. It was one of Silas's, a roughly shaped wolf that had been discarded in a corner. "Is this yours?" the boy asked, his voice a soft murmur. Silas nodded. "You made it?" Silas nodded again. The boy looked at the wolf, then back at Silas, a flicker of something like wonder in his eyes. "Could you teach me?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct. It was a question about more than carving wood. It was a question about connection, about sharing a piece of himself. It was everything he had come to this mountain to escape. He looked down at the boy, at his hopeful, upturned face, and felt the walls of his solitude begin to crack. He didn't answer with words. He reached for a small, smooth piece of birch and his carving knife. He handed them to the boy. "Be careful with the blade," he said. And with that, a silent contract was formed. Days bled into one another, marked not by a calendar, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the rhythm of chores and the slow, patient work of survival. Silas learned their names without asking. The girl was Elara, the boy, Leo, the little one, Willow. They fell into a routine born of necessity. Silas hunted and chopped wood. Elara, with a solemn maturity that belied her years, took over the cooking and mending. Leo, eager and observant, became Silas's shadow, learning to set snares, to read the tracks in the snow, to understand the silent language of the forest. Willow, the youngest, began to thaw. Her initial, fearful silence gave way to a child's natural curiosity. She would follow Silas around the cabin, her small hand sometimes finding its way into his large, calloused one. He never acknowledged it, but he never pulled away. The cabin, once a bastion of silence, was now filled with the small sounds of life. The murmur of the children's voices, the soft thud of Leo practicing with the carving knife, the occasional startling sound of Willow's laughter. It was a strange and unfamiliar music, and Silas found himself, to his own surprise, listening to its melody. He began to carve for them in the evenings. He finished the bird for Willow, a smooth, graceful creature that fit perfectly in her small palm. For Leo, he carved a wolf, its head tilted as if howling at a silent moon. He hadn't carved for anyone but himself in years. He'd forgotten the feeling of creating something for another, of seeing the quiet joy in their eyes. Elara remained a mystery. She spoke only when necessary, her words clipped and precise. She worked tirelessly, as if trying to earn their keep, to pay a debt she felt she owed. She held herself apart, a small, solitary figure wrapped in a mantle of responsibility. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the warm confines of the cabin, Silas found her staring into the fire, her face etched with a worry that seemed too heavy for her small frame. He sat down on the hearth near her, a rare breach of his self-imposed distance. "The storm will pass," he said, his voice a low rumble. She didn't look at him. "It's not the storm I'm afraid of." The words were spoken so softly, he almost didn't hear them. "What are you afraid of, Elara?" he asked, his voice gentler than he intended. She finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes filled with a pain that made him ache. "The men who are chasing us," she said. "They won't stop looking." And with those words, the fragile piece of their small world was shattered. The reality he had been trying to ignore, the past that had followed these children into his sanctuary, was now a tangible threat, a storm far more dangerous than the one howling outside his door. The name dropped into the quiet of the cabin like a stone in a still pond. Blackwood. That was the name of the man Elara spoke of, the man they were running from. She didn't say much more, her words sparse and choked with a fear she tried desperately to conceal. But Silas could piece together the fragments. A cruel man, a remote work camp, a debt that could never be paid. The children were not orphans in the traditional sense. They were fugitives from a form of servitude, their parents lost to the same brutal system. Blackwood saw them not as children, but as property. The knowledge settled a cold dread in Silas's gut. He had faced the harsh indifference of nature, the fury of blizzards, and the hunger of predators. But this was different. This was the deliberate, calculated cruelty of man, a force he had fled civilization to escape. He saw the way Elara watched the tree line now, the way she flinched at the sound of a falling branch. The fear was a poison, seeping into the sanctuary he had built. He began to teach them in earnest, not just to survive, but to be invisible. He showed Elara how to use the surrounding forest as a pantry and a medicine cabinet, which plants healed and which harmed. He taught Leo to move through the woods without leaving a trace, to read the wind and the sky, to become a part of the landscape. He even fashioned a small bow for him and spent hours teaching him to shoot, the soft thwack of the arrows hitting a makeshift target becoming a regular sound in the clearing. His solitude, once a fortress, now felt like a vulnerability. He was one man against what? A group? An organization? He didn't know. The uncertainty gnawed at him. He began to sleep less, his senses on high alert, listening for any unfamiliar sound in the night. He would sit up late, long after the children were asleep, cleaning his rifle with a meticulous, almost ritualistic care. The cold steel felt familiar in his hands, a grim comfort. He was a man of peace, but he had not forgotten the language of violence. One afternoon, while checking his snare lines with Leo, he found a footprint in the snow that was not his own. It was large, made by a heavy boot, and it was fresh. His blood ran cold. He motioned for Leo to be silent, his hand on the boy's shoulder, a silent command to stay put. He followed the tracks, his movements fluid and silent, his rifle held ready. The tracks led to a ridge overlooking his cabin, then circled back and disappeared into the dense woods to the north. They had been watched. He returned to the cabin, his face a grim mask. He didn't have to say anything. Elara saw it in his eyes. The unspoken question that had been hanging over them for weeks had finally been answered. They had been found. That night, the cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of fear. The children huddled together on the bearskin rug, their eyes wide and frightened. Silas didn't try to comfort them with empty words. He simply sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, a silent sentinel watching over his small, terrified flock. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind in the pines was a potential threat. The days grew tense, the fragile domesticity they had built replaced by a constant humming anxiety. Silas took to patrolling the perimeter of his clearing, his rifle a constant companion. He moved like a ghost through the trees, his senses sharpened by the imminent danger. He knew they wouldn't wait forever. Men like Blackwood were predators, and predators enjoyed the hunt. They would circle, test his defenses, and then, when they felt he was at his weakest, they would strike. He had to be ready. He found himself looking at the children, at their small, trusting faces, and a fierce, protective instinct he thought long dead rose within him. They were not his. He knew that. But in the crucible of this shared danger, a bond had been forged, stronger than blood, harder than steel. They were his to protect. The thought was as simple and as absolute as the mountain itself. One morning, he took Elara aside. He pressed a small, sharp hunting knife into her hand. "If they come, and I'm not here," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you take your brother and sister. You run. There's a small cave behind the waterfall, 2 miles up the creek. You hide there. You don't come out until you're sure it's safe." She looked at the knife, then at him, her eyes filled with a terrible understanding. "You're not going to let them take us," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of faith. "No," he said, his voice a gravelly promise. "I'm not." He began to prepare the cabin, not as a home, but as a fortress. He reinforced the door, barred the window, and created strategic firing positions. He was turning his sanctuary into a battlefield. The irony was not lost on him. He had come to this place to escape the violence of men, and now he was inviting it in, preparing to meet it with a violence of his own. The transformation of Silas was subtle, but profound. The quiet, solitary man who carved birds for children was gone, replaced by a grim, focused hunter. Leo watched him with a mixture of fear and admiration. He saw the way Silas's eyes constantly scanned the tree line, the way he moved with a coiled, deadly grace. He was seeing the man Silas had been before he came to the mountains, a man shaped by a past he never spoke of. The first move came not with a bang, but with a whisper. A dead rabbit, one of Silas's snares, was left on his doorstep, its throat cut. It was a message. "We are here. We can get this close." Silas said nothing, but he burned the carcass. The smell of burnt fur, a foul omen in the clean mountain air. The children stayed inside, the cabin their prison and their sanctuary. Elara tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, teaching Willow her letters, mending their worn clothes. But the fear was a constant, unwelcome guest at their table. Leo stopped asking to go out, his boyish enthusiasm extinguished by the palpable threat. He sat for hours by the fire, sharpening sticks into crude spears, his small face set in a determined scowl. The waiting stretched for 3 more days, a war of nerves. Silas slept in his chair, his rifle never leaving his side. He ate little, his body fueled by coffee and a grim resolve. He knew the attack would come at dawn or dusk, in the gray, uncertain light a favored ambush. On the 4th day, it came. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple when he heard it. The snap of a twig, too loud to be an animal. He motioned for the children to get down, to hide behind the stack of furs in the corner. He moved to his position by the window, his heart a slow, steady drum in his chest. He saw them then, 3 figures moving through the trees, their forms dark against the snow. They moved with a confident swagger, like men who were used to taking what they wanted. One of them, a large, bull-necked man with a cruel smile, was clearly the leader. Blackwood. Silas raised his rifle, the cold metal a familiar weight against his shoulder. He lined up the sights on Blackwood's chest. He could end it now, with 1 clean shot, but he hesitated. To kill a man, even a man like Blackwood, was to cross a line he had sworn never to cross again. It was to become the thing he had run from. But then he heard a small whimper from the corner where the children were hiding, and his resolve hardened. He was no longer just a man with a past. He was a protector, and he would protect his own. The shot, when it came, was deafening in the winter silence. But Silas didn't aim for Blackwood. He fired into the snow at the man's feet, a spray of white erupting inches from his boots. It was a warning, a declaration. He was not prey to be cornered. He would fight back. The shot shattered the evening's calm. Blackwood and his men dove for cover behind the trees. The clearing, once a place of quiet beauty, became a no-man's land. The hermit's got a rifle. One of the men yelled, his voice laced with surprise and anger. He can't watch all sides at once. Blackwood shouted back. Spread out. Silas knew he was right. He was one man, in one position. He moved away from the window, pressing his back against the solid log wall, listening. He could hear them circling the cabin, their movements cautious now. He had taken away their element of surprise. The children were silent, huddled in the corner, their faces pale with terror. Elara held Willow close, her hand over the little one's mouth to stifle her cries. Leo gripped one of his sharpened sticks, his knuckles white. Silas's mind raced. He had limited ammunition. They had the advantage of numbers and time. He had to make every shot count. He had to do something unexpected. A floorboard creaked on the porch. One of them was at the door. Silas moved silently, positioning himself beside the entrance. He held his breath, listening to the scraping sound of a knife trying to find purchase in the wood around the lock. Then, with a sudden, explosive force, a heavy boot slammed against the door. The wood shuddered, but the reinforced bar held. Another kick and another. The hinges groaned in protest. Silas knew the door wouldn't last forever. He had to act. He moved to the hearth and grabbed the heavy iron poker, its end still glowing faintly from the fire. He returned to his position by the door, just as it splintered and burst inward. A large man stumbled through the opening, his eyes wide as he tried to adjust to the dim light. He never had the chance. Silas swung the poker with all his strength, a desperate, brutal arc of glowing iron. The man went down with a sickening thud and lay still. The smell of seared flesh filled the air. Silas didn't hesitate. He stepped over the fallen man and out onto the porch, firing a shot into the darkness toward the trees where he'd last seen the second man. A cry of pain answered him. He had hit his mark. The night fell silent again, a tense, waiting silence. "You're a dead man, hermit." Blackwood's voice roared from the darkness, but there was a new note in it now, a note of uncertainty. Silas didn't answer. He retreated back into the cabin, barricading the broken door with a heavy table. He reloaded his rifle, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was no longer Silas, the recluse. He was a cornered animal, fighting for his young. The second man lay groaning in the snow, clutching a wounded arm. Blackwood was alone, hidden somewhere in the darkness. The dynamic had shifted. The hunters had become the hunted. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. The wounded man's moans grew weaker, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Silas stayed by the shattered door, his rifle pointed into the darkness, his eyes straining to see any movement. He knew Blackwood was still out there, watching, waiting. Pride and cruelty were powerful motivators. He wouldn't leave without a final attempt. Suddenly, a flicker of orange caught his eye. Smoke. He smelled it a second later. The roof. Blackwood had circled around and set the roof on fire. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him for a second. The cabin, his fortress, was about to become a trap. "Out the back," he hissed to the children. "Go now. To the creek. Don't stop." Elara didn't question him. She grabbed her siblings' hands and pulled them toward the small back window he had indicated. Leo hesitated, looking back at Silas, his eyes pleading. "Go," Silas commanded, his voice a harsh bark that sent the boy scrambling after his sisters. The smoke was getting thicker, burning his eyes and throat. The crackle of the flames overhead was growing louder. He waited until he was sure the children were out. Then he took a deep breath, kicked the table away from the door, and charged out into the night, roaring like a cornered bear. He fired his rifle wildly into the darkness, not aiming at anything, just creating chaos, drawing attention to himself, away from the fleeing children. He saw a dark shape detach itself from the trees. Blackwood. He was running not toward Silas, but toward the path leading to the creek, trying to cut off the children. A cold, murderous rage, unlike anything Silas had felt in years, consumed him. He dropped his rifle and sprinted, his powerful legs eating up the snowy ground. He was faster than Blackwood, fueled by a primal need to protect. He tackled the man from behind, a brutal, crashing impact that sent them both tumbling into the snow. They rolled and clawed at each other like wild animals, a tangle of limbs and fury in the flickering firelight. Blackwood was strong, but Silas was stronger, his muscles hardened by years of physical labor. He fought with a silent, desperate intensity. This was not about justice. It was about survival. His survival, the children's survival. He gained the upper hand, his hands finding Blackwood's throat. His vision narrowed to the man's contorted, hate-filled face. The past he had run from, the violence he had tried to bury, it was all here, in his hands. He could feel the life draining from the man beneath him. And then, through the roaring in his ears, he heard a small voice cry out, "Silas!" It was Leo. He was standing at the edge of the trees, his face a mask of terror and awe. The sound of his name, spoken by the boy, cut through the red haze of his rage. He looked down at the man he was about to kill, and then at the boy who was watching him. He was not a murderer. He would not become one in front of this child. He released his grip. The aftermath was a scene of quiet devastation. The cabin, his home, was a smoldering ruin, the flames casting a hellish glow against the night sky. Blackwood lay gasping in the snow, defeated and broken. The other two men were silent, one inside the ruin, the other a dark shape in the distance. Silas stood, breathing heavily, the cold night air searing his lungs. The rage had passed, leaving behind a profound emptiness. He had won, but he had lost his sanctuary. The children emerged slowly from the woods, their eyes wide with shock. They looked at the burning cabin, at the defeated man in the snow, at Silas, his face smudged with soot, his knuckles bloody. He must have looked like a monster to them. He turned away, unable to meet their gaze, ashamed of the violence they had witnessed. He walked a short distance away and sank to his knees in the snow, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him. He had saved them, but he had destroyed the peace he had so carefully built. He had become the very thing he despised. He felt a small hand on his shoulder. He looked up. It was Elara. Her face was not filled with fear or revulsion. It was filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. Leo and Willow stood beside her, their small hands reaching out to touch him. They were not afraid of him. They were comforting him. In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of his past and the terrified, resilient children who had become his present, Silas understood. Home was not a place. It was not a structure of logs and mud. He had been wrong. Solitude was not strength. He looked at the three small faces illuminated by the dying flames of his former life, and he knew. His solitude had ended the morning they appeared in his clearing, and he had not been alone since. The fire burned itself out by dawn, leaving behind a blackened, skeletal ruin and a plume of gray smoke that rose into the cold morning sky. Everything Silas owned was gone. The tools he had used to build his life, the few mementos of a past he rarely acknowledged, the very walls that had sheltered him, all of it was ash. He stood with the children, watching the sun rise over the mountains, the familiar peaks now seeming like foreign territory. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back, a hunting knife, and the three souls who now looked to him for everything. Blackwood was gone. He had fled into the forest during the night, a broken man leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Silas had let him go. Killing him would have solved nothing. The fight was over. For a long time, no one spoke. The children were in shock, their small faces smudged and tear-streaked. They huddled close to Silas, their shared warmth a small comfort against the vast, indifferent cold. It was Leo who finally broke the silence. "What will we do now?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Silas looked down at the boy, then at the smoldering remains of his cabin. He had no answer. The future was a blank, terrifying expanse. He had come to these mountains to be alone, to live a simple life dictated by the seasons. Now, that life was impossible. He was responsible for them. He had to get them to safety, to a town, to civilization. The thought made his stomach churn. He had not set foot in a town in 5 years. He had no money, no connections, nothing to offer but his own 2 hands. He was a ghost, a man who had intentionally erased himself from the world. How could he possibly re-enter it, with 3 children in tow? "We walk," he said, the words feeling inadequate, but they were the only truth he had. He salvaged what he could from the wreckage: a blackened pot, a half-burnt blanket, a small bag of oats. It wasn't much. He fashioned makeshift snowshoes for the children from sapling branches and strips of leather from his belt. The journey would be long and difficult. He knew the way to the nearest settlement, a small logging town called Jasper's Creek, but it was a hard 3-day walk through unforgiving terrain. He looked at the children, at their thin coats and worn boots. He doubted they would make it, but they had to try. They set off in the late morning, a small, somber procession against the vast white landscape. Silas took the lead, his long strides breaking a trail for the children to follow. Elara came next, holding Willow's hand. Leo trailed behind, his face set with a grim determination, a small, carved wolf clutched in his fist. The first day was brutal. The snow was deep, the wind relentless. Willow, weakened by the ordeal, began to falter by midday. Silas, without a word, lifted her onto his shoulders. She was a feather-light weight, her small, cold hands clinging to his hair. He felt the immense burden of her trust, of all their trust. He was their protector, their provider, their only hope. The weight of it was heavier than any log he had ever carried. That night, they made a crude shelter in a rocky outcropping, huddled together for warmth around a small, smoky fire. They ate the last of the oats, a thin, watery gruel that did little to warm their bellies. The children fell into an exhausted sleep, but Silas stayed awake, watching the stars, a cold knot of despair tightening in his chest. He was failing them. He had saved them from Blackwood, only to lead them to a slower, colder death in the wilderness. He had been a fool to think he could do this. The next day was worse. A storm blew in, a blizzard that reduced visibility to a few feet and turned the world into a maelstrom of swirling snow and ice. They were forced to take shelter again, this time in a hollowed-out log, the wind howling around them like a hungry wolf. They had no food. The cold was a physical pain, seeping into their bones. Willow was feverish, her breathing shallow. Elara held her close, her own face pale and drawn. Leo, trying to be brave, shivered uncontrollably. Silas felt a familiar despair begin to close in, the same despair that had driven him to the mountains in the first place. He was not enough. He had never been enough. He had failed his first family, and now he was failing this one. He closed his eyes, the faces of the children blurring with the faces from his past. He was so tired. It would be so easy to just stop, to let the cold take them, to let the silence return. But then he felt a small hand slip into his. It was Leo. The boy looked up at him, his eyes clear and steady. "You taught me how to find the North Star," the boy said, his voice quiet but strong, "even when you can't see it. You said you just have to know where to look." Silas stared at the boy, at the unwavering faith in his eyes. It was a faith Silas didn't deserve, but it was there, and it was a lifeline. He squeezed the boy's hand. He could not give up. He would not give up. He would get them out of this, or he would die trying. The storm broke on the 3rd day. The world was pristine and white, the air still and frigid. Willow's fever had worsened. She was delirious, muttering in her sleep. Silas knew she wouldn't last another day. They had to reach the town. He carried her in his arms, her small body frighteningly still. He pushed himself onward, driven by a desperate, single-minded purpose. Elara and Leo struggled to keep up, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Late in the afternoon, when Silas thought he could not take another step, he saw it. A thin plume of smoke rising from a valley below. A sign of life. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through him. It gave him a new strength. He half ran, half stumbled down the slope, the children following behind him. They emerged from the trees into a clearing. A small cabin, not unlike his own, stood nestled in the snow. A light glowed in the window. An old trapper, his face a road map of wrinkles, opened the door before Silas could even knock. He took one look at the desperate man and the half-frozen children, and his eyes softened with a deep, weary kindness. "Get them inside," the trapper said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "There's a fire on, and stew." The warmth of the trapper's cabin was a shock to their systems. It was small and cluttered, smelling of pine smoke, curing leather, and something warm and savory. The old man, who introduced himself as Jed, moved with a quiet competence, helping them out of their wet clothes, wrapping them in thick wool blankets, ladling hot stew into bowls. He tended to Willow with practiced hands, forcing a warm, sweet broth between her lips. "She be all right," he said, his eyes meeting Silas's over the child's sleeping form. "Just needs warmth and rest." Silas could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He watched as Elara and Leo ate, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but shining with a relief that was almost painful to see. They were safe. He had done it. He had gotten them here. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, the accumulated exhaustion of the past days hitting him all at once. Jed steadied him with a firm hand on his arm. "You too, son," the old man said gently. "You look like you've been to hell and back." Silas didn't correct him. He had. Jed asked no questions. He seemed to understand that their story was not one for casual conversation. He simply provided what they needed: food, warmth, and a safe place to heal. For 2 days they rested. The children slept, their bodies and spirits slowly mending. Silas found himself talking to Jed, the words coming more easily than they had in years. He didn't tell him everything, but he told him enough. He spoke of the children, of the fire, of the journey through the storm. Jed listened, nodding, his weathered face impassive. "A man does what he has to do," was all he said when Silas finished. On the 3rd day, Jed announced he was going into town for supplies. "Jasper's Creek is another day's walk from here," he said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. But those children, they need more than an old trapper can give them." Silas knew he was right. They needed a doctor, proper clothes, a real home. They needed a future. "I'll go with you," Silas said. He knew what he had to do. He had to face the world he had abandoned. For them, the walk to Jasper's Creek was different. The sun was shining, the path was cleared by Yet's frequent travels, and the children, rested and fed, had regained some of their resilience. As they neared the town, Silas felt a familiar anxiety tighten his chest. The sounds, the smells, the sight of so many people, it was overwhelming. He had forgotten how loud the world was. Jasper's Creek was not a large town, just a muddy main street lined with a few dozen wooden buildings. But to Silas, it felt like a sprawling metropolis. People turned to stare at their small, ragged group, at the big, wild-looking man with the 3 children. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He wanted to turn and flee back to the silence of the mountains. But he looked down at Elara's hand, which had found its way into his, and he kept walking. They went first to the doctor, a kind, bustling woman who pronounced Willow fully recovered. Then Jed took them to the general store, where he used his own credit to buy them new clothes and boots. As Silas watched the children being fitted, a profound sense of his own inadequacy washed over him. He could not provide for them. He was a stranger here with nothing to his name. The thought of separating from them, of leaving them at an orphanage or with the town authorities, was a physical pain. He couldn't do it. They were his family now. They were standing outside the store, trying to figure out their next move, when a man in a sheriff's uniform approached them. "You the fellow who came out of the mountains with these children?" he asked, his eyes sharp and assessing. Silas nodded, his body tensing. "There's a warrant out for a man named Blackwood," the sheriff said, "for kidnapping and forced labor. Some folks up north finally got brave enough to talk. We found his camp. It was empty." The sheriff looked at Elara, his gaze softening. "We heard there were 3 children who escaped. We've been looking for you." Relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over Silas. It was over. Truly over. The law would handle Blackwood. The children were finally truly safe. The sheriff made arrangements for them to stay at the local boarding house, the town's coffers covering the expense. He assured them that the authorities would find a proper home for the children. That night, tucked into clean, soft beds, the children fell asleep instantly. But Silas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a hollow ache in his chest. A proper home. He was not a proper home. He was a broken man who lived in the woods. Tomorrow, they would be taken from him. He would be alone again. The thought was unbearable. He had found something in the wilderness he never knew he was looking for. And now he was going to lose it. He had to do something. The next morning, he found the sheriff at his office. "I want to adopt them," Silas said, the words feeling both insane and absolutely right. "All 3 of them?" The sheriff looked at him, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. You're a drifter, a mountain man. You have no job, no house. What can you possibly offer these children?" "A home," Silas said, his voice steady. "I can give them a home." He knew it was a long shot. He knew the law was not on his side, but he had to try. He spent the next few weeks proving himself. He took a job at the local sawmill, the hard physical labor familiar and grounding. He worked from sunup to sundown, saving every penny. He rented a small, run-down house at the edge of town and spent his evenings repairing it, making it a place a family could live. The townspeople watched him, their initial suspicion slowly giving way to a grudging respect. They saw the way the children's faces lit up when he came to visit them at the boarding house. They saw the fierce, quiet love that bound this unlikely family together. Finally, the day of the hearing came. Silas stood before a stern-faced judge, the sheriff by his side. He spoke simply and honestly about how he had found the children, about how they had survived together. He didn't have much to offer in the way of material wealth, but he offered them something more valuable. "I can't give them much," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Elara, Leo, and Willow sitting in the front row. "But I will give them my life. I will protect them. I will teach them. And I will love them." He had laid his heart bare. It was all he had. The judge looked at Silas, then at the children. He saw the bond between them, the unspoken language of a family forged in fire and ice. He saw the hope in their eyes. He cleared his throat. "In the eyes of the law," the judge said, a small smile touching his lips, "a home is not made of walls, but of the people who live within them. Custody granted." Silas walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, a child's hand in each of his, a small girl perched on his shoulders. He was no longer Silas, the recluse. He was Silas, a father. He had walked out of the wilderness with nothing, and he had found everything.